We are now going to take a look at Genesis chapter 23, which concerns the death and burial of Sarah, and I'm calling this Grave Thoughts. On January the 17th, 1912, Captain Scott successfully led his team to the South Pole. And Edward Wilson, who was trapped with Scott in a final fatal blizzard, he penned these words to his wife: "Do not be unhappy, all is for the best. We are playing a good part in a great scheme arranged by God himself, and all is well." And Genesis 23 is similarly teaching us that Sarah's death also plays a good part in a great scheme arranged by God himself. And did you notice that Genesis 23 is an insertion? The next chapter is about Abraham sending out his servant to Nahor's family to bring back a wife for Isaac, and this turns out to be none other than Rebekah. So wouldn't it make more sense to introduce this story with the verses we find at the end of Genesis chapter 22 concerning the 12 sons who were born to Abraham's brother Nahor, but highlighting Rebekah amongst all that testosterone? I mean, instead Moses chooses to insert Genesis 23. Why? Well, first, up till now the primary focus has been upon the working out of God's purposes through Abraham and Sarah. But the moment God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the focus changed. The primary focus is now upon the working out of God's purposes through Isaac, and the death of Sarah underscores this. The unique marriage relationship between Abraham and Sarah was crucial to the outworking of God's purpose. It should never have been sullied by Abraham having sex with Hagar. And as we look to the future, the working out of God's purpose through Isaac similarly requires the creation of a unique and protected marriage relationship. And so Genesis 23, by emphasizing Sarah's death and burial, is enabling us to refocus. There is a second reason for the insertion of Genesis 23, and it has to do with where God's people belong. Anthropologists have spoken of hominids going back perhaps 2 million years. Well, forget that. We go back to Genesis 2 and the time when God created the first human who would share his image and likeness. As a potter fashions a beautiful glazed pot out of clay, so we read, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now this is figurative language that doesn't tell us anything about the actual biological process God used or when it happened. And perhaps you may read it literally if you choose, but whatever, the key point is that the Lord God formed Adam from Adama. Now Adama is the word for the ground, the earth, and Adam represents all human beings. So we're all earthlings. We're made from the earth and we belong to the earth. Now, if you'll excuse the pun, where on earth am I going with all this? Well, not only our origin, but also our physical disintegration and death, merging back into the earth, underscores where we belong. Now, you may have heard about the famous conductor who visited Beethoven's grave, and as he stood there, he heard this strange, discordant noise emanating from the tomb. And he suddenly realized that this was, in fact, Beethoven's 9th Symphony being played backwards. And yes, it was the sound of Beethoven decomposing. As God puts it in Genesis 3:19, dust you are, and to dust you will return. We will decompose. We're earthlings. Sarah died. Where does Sarah belong? It will not do for her to be buried just anywhere on the face of the earth, earthling though she is. Over the years, Abraham would have buried some deceased members of his sizable entourage outside the borders of Canaan, for example, in Egypt, in Philistine territory. But Sarah must be buried in Canaan, not in ancestral burial grounds in Ur of the Chaldeans, where they emanated from, or anywhere else, because Canaan is the sphere in which God promised to create this new humanity, and Sarah belongs to the new humanity. Now, Abraham and Sarah didn't know that the formation of the nation of Israel living in Canaan was just phase 1. I mean, God always had a bigger game plan, the creation of a new heavens and a new earth, ruled over by an image-bearing new humanity made up of people from every tribe and language and people and nations. Anyway, we've seen that there are 2 reasons why Genesis chapter 23 is inserted. First, because it's the time to refocus, and second, because Canaan is the place Sarah belongs, just as we, as God's people, with resurrected bodies, belong to a new earth reunited with heaven. In a famous 1999 study, participants were asked to view the video which recorded a basketball game, and they were told to count the number of passes one team made. And during the video, a woman dressed in a gorilla costume, she walks into the game, she turns to face the camera, and she beats her fists on her chest. And you know what? The participants were focusing on the passes being made, and so it turned out that only 50% of them ever saw the gorilla. Now, Genesis 23 is preceded and followed by stress on the importance of Rebecca. Rebecca before and Rebecca after, that's the stress. And as it were, she is the one, if you like, dressed in the gorilla suit who's beating her fists on her chest. And so we've got to avoid being so fixated on Sarah that we fail to see that Genesis 23 is paving the way for Rebecca to take over from where Sarah leaves off. And that's why, immediately before Genesis 23, Rebecca's name is singled out among Nahor's 12 sons. It's not only anticipating the future 12 tribes of Israel, but that God already has a wife lined up for Isaac. Sarah's died, and soon there's going to be a complete changing of the guard. But God already has the future firmly under his control. Now, in the last chapter, Abraham thought that the son he loved so greatly was about to die. And now he faces the reality that the woman he has loved so greatly, the woman with whom he has shared his life for, I believe, about over 100 years, has died. And this chapter treasures the memory of Sarah, the only woman in the Bible whose death is recorded and whose age at death is noted. Now, many observe that mourning over Sarah's death only takes up the first 2 verses, and many see the rest of the chapter as being about how Abraham comes to possess parts of the promised land. I beg to differ. The phrase, bury my dead, bury your dead, occurs 7 times in this chapter. Abraham requests the Hittites, sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. They reply, none of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Abraham asked the Hittites to intercede for him with Ephron. Ask him to sell the cave of Machpelah to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron responds, I give the field and the cave in it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. And Abraham agrees to pay the price of the field. He says, accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. And Ephron invites Abraham to pay the price he's asking for the field and land, and he says, bury your dead. The chapter concludes. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. And so the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. So in Genesis 23, Abraham doesn't buy land so he can possess at least part of the promised land. That's not why he's doing it. I mean, this is a man in grief. He's mourning, he's weeping over the death of his wife. And to Abraham, Sarah's death is like no other. She is extra special. And he wants to make sure he has a very special burial place for this woman who, with all her flaws, was so utterly precious to him. Husbands, treasure your wives, and wives your husbands, until death do us part. Back in New Zealand, I had this girlfriend who was a head nurse in a major hospital, and she had a particular concern for the terminally ill, and she'd get very upset if any nurse failed to treat the body of a deceased person with dignity and respect. In Genesis 23, we see Abraham honouring his much-loved wife, treating her dead body with great dignity and providing her with her own special burial place. The Hittites tell Abraham, you are a mighty prince among us, that is, a prince of God, literally. The name Sarah means princess. So Sarah was Abraham's princess, and Abraham treats her as royalty in her death. And so important is this, that he pays an exorbitant price for Ephron's field and cave, 400 shekels of silver, we're told. Now later on, Jeremiah also buys a field in the promised land and only pays 17 shekels of silver for it. That's a lot later too. And when David insists on paying the full price for the thrashing floor of Araunah and his oxen, on which the temple was to be built, you know what? He only paid 50 shekels of silver. So I think we can be pretty certain that Ephron is exploiting the situation here and ripping Abraham off. And no doubt Ephron would have justified his raising of the burial cost on the cost of living. Anyway, Abraham's not interested in bartering. He doesn't care what the price is. What matters to him is finding a special place to bury his wife. Now, a major theme of the Abraham narratives is that of listening. God commanded Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And Abraham showed remarkable faith in obeying this command. But he didn't fully listen. He was told to leave his father's household. But we read, Abraham left as the Lord had told him. Yeah, that's good. But later, unnecessary conflict results when Abraham... But the problem is, he went as God told him, but Lot went with him. And then later on, of course, he listens to the voice of his wife, doesn't he, when she tells him to have sex with Hagar, like Adam listening to Eve. And then, at the end of Genesis 22, God throws open the channels of blessing to all the world, doesn't he? And why is it? He says, because you listened to me. And in Genesis 23, you'll see that word listen is used repeatedly. So that to the Hittites, he says, Sir, listen to us. Abraham responds, asking them to listen to him. Ephron pipes up saying, Abraham, listen to me. Abraham responds, listen to me. Ephron responds again, listen to me, my Lord. And when you work through all the listenings that are going on, it's Abraham who ends up listening to Ephron rather than the other way around. But of course this is all in the providence of God. Abraham bought this burial site simply as a place to bury his deeply cherished wife. And so it becomes, he didn't realise this, but it ends up being the burial place for himself when he dies, and for Isaac and for Jacob. So in God's providence it becomes a symbol of the fact that Abraham has genuine rights not only to this particular piece of property within the land, but to the entire land of Canaan. And so it turns out that given the providence of God, when Abraham listens to the Hittites and listens to Ephron, it is as if he's listening to God himself. Some witch said, show me where Stalin is buried and I will show you a communist plot. Well, show me where Sarah is buried and I will show you God's plot or plan. Because God was working out his own good purpose as Abraham listened to Ephron, even though it involves the probable injustice of being charged an exorbitant amount. Now today, the location of this burial site in the Hebron highlands, where Abraham probably camped in summer to escape the heat, it causes great tension between Jews and Muslims. Muslims, of course, also venerate Abraham. And there is a site that's claimed to be the Cave of Machpelah, often called the Cave of the Patriarchs, which makes Hebron the second most important city in Israel. And Jews regularly make pilgrimage to this site. Muslims make their own claim to this burial ground. They call it Abraham's Mosque, or Abraham's Holy Site. And similarly, of course, we think of Buddhists who make pilgrimage to various locations to venerate the relics of the Buddha and other venerated Buddhist figures housed in what they call stupas. And Hindus and Muslims, they similarly make pilgrimages to the shrines of venerated persons. But Abraham never intended for this place of burial to be treated as a sacred site. Indeed, in verse 4 and verse 8, there is an important phrase which is often left untranslated. It is the phrase, out of my sight. And so in verse 4, Abraham says, sell me some property for a burial site here, so I can bury my dead out of my sight. And again in verse 8 he says, if you're willing to let me bury my dead out of my sight. Back in Isaiah 51 and verses 1 to 2, we read, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who gave you birth. So not merely Abraham, but Sarah too, must be remembered as integral to the way God began this wonderful work of creating a new humanity. Abraham certainly did not want this burial place to be treated as a sacred site or place of pilgrimage. He simply wanted Sarah's body to be put aside in a dignified and appropriate manner out of sight. Now we learn about the cult of the dead from texts unearthed in the ancient port city of Ugarit these things were unearthed in 1928. And the deceased were often buried beneath their homes, we learn. Surviving family, which believed that the nephesh, or the soul of the deceased, was still present, they hoped to please their dead ancestors by offering them food and drink, all to ensure the well-being of the family and the fertility of their crops. There's actually quite a close relationship between the Hittites and the society in Ugarit. And likewise, we can see that the Canaanites evidently had their own version of ancestor worship. One Old Testament scholar, Gerhard von Rad, astutely observes that the surprising number of regulations that we find in the Old Testament against the cult of the dead and the rites that pertain to it allow of the conclusion that a particularly bitter warfare was waged against it, as a cult which offered special temptations to ancient people. So God's people were tempted by this cult of the dead. Abraham speaks of wanting a burial place for Sarah that is out of sight. And so this serves as an implicit polemic against the cult of the dead as practiced by the Canaanites. In Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 4, the extent to which God's people later took on Canaanite cultic practices is indicated when God reproves his people, describing them as a people who sit among the graves and spend their nights keeping secret vigil. So the cult of the dead was a real point of temptation for God's people. God promised to bless others through Abraham. The Canaanites have experienced this. And for example, it was Abraham, wasn't it, who recovered all the people and plunder that was taken by the invading kings back in Genesis chapter 14. And when the Hittites hail him as a prince of God, this may imply that Abraham had come in their society to act somewhat like a regional governor, dealing with disputes and things like that, I guess. So over a long period of time, Abraham had achieved considerable status in the society of his day, and he was respected for the role he played as a wise and good leader. And yet, Abraham is forced to introduce himself to them, saying, "I am an alien and a stranger among you." Abraham had no ancestral rights in Canaan itself. And it's only because, in God's providence, that he has achieved such high status over a long period of time that the Hittites would even consider enabling him to acquire land for any purpose. So, when Abraham requests a burial site, they respond, "None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Interesting here, isn't it, that they seem to be assuming that Abraham wouldn't mind having his wife's remains just placed alongside the remains of Hittites. But of course, for future Jewish readers, separation from other peoples is a fundamental thing in order to be the distinctive people of God. And they would readily understand why Abraham needs a distinct burial place solely for the burial of his wife. There's another thing going on here. You might remember back in Genesis 14 that the king of Sodom offered to give all the plunder to Abraham after he rescued it from those invading kings. And he replied, "I'll accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the thong of a sandal, so that you'll never be able to say, 'I made Abraham rich.'" And similarly, Abraham pays an exorbitant price for the field and land so that no one could possibly say that Abraham didn't have full rights to claim this land as his own. And so no Canaanite could ever claim to have enriched Abraham. Now Genesis 23 signals a major transition from one great matriarch, Sarah, to another, Rebekah, as we've seen. But the progenitors of Israel, both Abraham and Sarah, belong to the land God has given them. So Sarah must be buried in Canaan, and it is because Abraham treasured Sarah so greatly that he is prepared to pay any price to secure for her a special burial place. In listening to the Hittites and Ephron, Abraham is effectively listening to God, since it is God in his providence who provides this foothold in the land of Canaan, one in which other patriarchs will also be buried. Finally, we come to the great irony of this passage. The Hittites speak of giving Abraham the burial site he wants. And when Ephron becomes involved, he similarly tells him, "I will give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. It's ironic, isn't it, that the Hittites talk of giving this land to Abraham because God had already promised Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. The Hittites mistakenly think the land is theirs to give. In reality, it already all belongs to Abraham. Think of Psalm 24:1. What does it say? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So it's doubly ironic, isn't it, that Abraham should be an alien and stranger in a land that already belongs to him. And it was even more ironic that Jesus should be treated as if he did not belong to the world he himself created. We too are aliens and strangers in this world. We are earthlings. And though God's people will often encounter rejection in this world, it is to God's people alone that this earth truly belongs. That's why Jesus said, didn't he? Referring to God's people, his disciples, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And we read, by faith Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Well, the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God, is the heavenly Jerusalem, described at the end of the book of Revelation, which will one day descend at the time when a new heaven and a new earth is brought into being. And then it will be said, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. It is then that we will truly feel what it means for this world to really be our true home, the home we will share with our God forevermore.